everyone. I am Bill Batterman. I coach debate at Woodward Academy, and I'm here with Will Repko. Hi, Will.
Hello.
So the trajectory of our criminal justice reform topic so far has been heavily in the direction of agent-based arguments, separation of powers-based arguments, federalism, related arguments, and that kind of thing, and less in just kind of criminal justice reform, good, bad, back and forth. So the crime disadvantage is relatively uncommon. Related disadvantages about terrorism or whatever are relatively uncommon. So many debates are about critiques, abolition versus reform, and that kind of thing. But of the sort of disadvantaged subset of debates, many are about agent counterplans and what I would describe as separation of powers related arguments. So the court's counterplan or the executive counterplan, and a disadvantage about presidential powers or court power or whatever. State's counterplan, or states pressure the federal government counterplan with a federalism net benefit. And it seems as I think about that those strategies will need to change. Maybe the strategy doesn't need to change, but the explanation and some of the evidence will need to change, because the context for the separation of powers debate is significantly different with Biden as president than when Trump was president. So I guess I want to start with federalism. For the last 4 years or 5 years, there's been a set of arguments grounded in pretty high quality evidence from scholars about the possibility of robust federalism constraining the Trump administration. So beginning right away, Erwin Chemerinsky and the colleagues started writing about this. They saw state action, either state action to take policy initiatives on their own, or in particular to stop cooperating with federal initiatives. They saw that as a way to constrain the Trump administration's ability to implement its agenda. They saw it as a way to push back against Trump administration priorities. They saw states like California as powerful agents who could potentially check some of the worst policies of the Trump administration. And so in debate, the way that played out was the federalism dissent had a impact about constraining Trump and constraining federal overreach and protecting the environment, or reducing climate change, even when the federal government is trying to remove those restrictions and that kind of thing. And now all of a sudden, the Biden administration is enacting all of these executive orders to do all of the things that the pro-federalism folks, the pro-progressive federalism folks wanted. He's restricting oil and gas drilling. He's incentivizing renewable energy. He's doing all of the things that federalism was seen as a check against. So as we look ahead to the next 4 years, and in particular just to this year's worth of debates, how do you see the federalism impact playing out differently? And do you have any ideas about how to continue to defend federalism as the negative in an environment when now the federal government is likely to be more progressive than the vast majority of the states?
Yeah, so great question. The first thing I would say is that some, but not all, of your federalism impacts are going to need to be Bidenified. I do think that certainly the ones that kind of the author is writing from the perspective of, hey, California needs to be operating outside of Trump norms or being way more green than Washington, D.C. was in 2018. Those cards, I think, are prone to kind of an immediate not assume Biden argument by the affirmative. But the truth of the matter is that, not all of those arguments are going to be completely irrelevant. I mean, consider what California is and how liberal it is, not from the perspective of California v. Trump, but instead from the further more progressive portions of the Democratic Party vis-a-vis Biden. So there's going to be a new wave of literature which suggests that states need to sort of put an additional level of pressure on the Biden administration, because whatever executive vision the Biden administration has for the Paris Accords as it relates to climate is insufficient, and there needs to be even greater action done by the states, either to directly reduce greenhouse gases or to indirectly pressure the Biden administration to go even further. So I don't think that the central federal government versus decentralized states arguments are completely irrelevant. And then I guess I would also add that in the same way that you saw Chemerinsky and other more liberal scholars writing about how problematic it is to have a powerful conservative federal government in DC, you're going to see some of the authors that write publications out of George Mason University and some of the more kind of classic constitutional conservatives begin to talk about federalism again as a good way to solve from their perspective for the excessively liberal Biden administration in Washington, D.C. And so you're going to see a different set of impacts that aren't about progressive causes, but maybe are about conservative causes, and even some conservative causes that negatives might feel comfortable defending: economic, smaller government, etc. So the script, I think, just flips. I mean, in general, not to be too cynical, people are fans of federalism when they dislike Washington, D.C., and they're not fans of federalism when they like what's going on politically in D.C. And there's a whole group of interested people that are willing to sort of write the literature on either side of that question. Very few people are actually principled about the notion of federalism. Many of them are writing about it because they want a certain policy outcome, and that will not change just because there was a significant flip in ideology between the Trump administration to the Biden administration.
Yeah, I think the same dynamic is at play in academic and political conversations about presidential powers. So that's been a big staple of the criminal justice reform topic. Executive counterplan, executive constraints bad, disadvantage. Congress getting too involved in legislating too much undermines the president, or just an internal net benefit that aggressive presidential policymaking is desirable because it strengthens presidential powers, and that's good. That was a little bit of a tougher sell, I think, during the Trump administration because of all the lawlessness and kind of extreme actions that the Trump administration was taking. Now that Biden is the president, some of those arguments about the importance of presidential flexibility and the speed with which the president can unilaterally act in times of crisis and that kind of thing, hopefully the Biden administration will show superior leadership on COVID, and that becomes another example of how important it is to have a competent federal government. Those executive power, presidential power, executive flexibility, good arguments can be updated similarly for the Biden administration. I guess my question there is for debaters trying to answer those arguments. I think during the Trump administration, it was pretty easy to say Trump disproves these things, even if these arguments are true in the abstract, they're not true under Trump. Trump and the Department of Justice under William Barr are not they do not achieve the benefits of executive flexibility that the more generic evidence is describing. Now that negative teams who are reading the presidential power good disadvantage don't have to deal with Trump anymore and can just say it's good that Biden has more flexibility, we don't want McConnell to constrain Biden. What do you think the affirmative, who's pushing back against that, should be looking into as they research? How do you think they'll need to adapt their arguments in an environment where they can't just say, but Trump is a bad president, so presidential powers are bad?
Yeah, so the premise, and it was sort of your lead into this, I think is the same. I believe I read an article the other day that said people are fans of presidential authority basically based on their ideology. So once again, you're going to find a group of people that are writing post the Biden victory that are not fans of a strong unilateral executive branch or an unchecked unilateral branch, executive branch. Then I think I would, first of all of the theoretical cards, the cards that, don't speak from the perspective of the Trump administration or the Biden administration and just sort of are these Hamiltonian arguments that presidential authority is abstractly important. I think all of those just lose on sort of not being specific enough to the moment. You know what I mean? And we can have an academic debate about whether or not, presidential power should be at this level, or this level. But the truth of the matter is the outcomes that they generate in the context of this presidency and in current global security situations around the world, or, a variety of other impacts, that's really what would determine whether or not presidential power should or should not increase. I think if I was against those arguments, if I was affirmative and I wanted to impact turn I would first and foremost be like, their cards aren't terribly specific to Biden. And then I would research a few areas where enhanced presidential authority from the Biden administration might play out badly. There are certainly people that write, for instance, that additional flexibility from the presidency on Iran policy or on climate policy, which are two areas that I definitely think the Biden administration is going to exercise more executive flexibility and a different approach than the Trump administration. There are people that write that that will play out badly. There's no shortage of relatively conservative scholars that argue that Biden's potential approach to Iran, especially if given more flexibility, will backfire. There's a lot of people that are willing to argue that the greater flexibility that the Biden administration has on China, on climate, et cetera, will all generate sort of disadvantageous outcomes. And I think that there might be room for an affirmative to kind of surprise a negative who's reading stale or older evidence and relying on the fact that their stale or older evidence applies a little bit better because Biden is a more traditional president than the unconventional Trump presidency. And that team might be caught off guard with a really specific nuanced impact turn that says Biden Iran policy or Biden's Asia policy is a mistake. And I do think that that could pay dividends for a savvy, well-prepared affirmative.
The last thing I want to ask you about is what I think was one of the other big changes that the Trump administration made on the way that arguments are debated. I think the politics DA is probably the number one effect that it had just in terms of the argument, composition of arguments in debate. But I think number two is the way that the Trump administration affected the way that debaters tend to understand fiat and circumvention and interbranch relationships and conflict. And the argument that this generation of students has experienced their whole career is, something like the affirmative says the federal government should change its policy from A to B, and then the negative says, well, but Trump won't do that. Trump will not change from A to B. And then the affirmative says, well, but that's what fiat is for. And the negative says, no, Trump thumps, Trump, circumvents, Trump doesn't comply. Or if it's not Trump, it's some element of his administration. It's William Barr, or it's an entire agency, ICE won't comply, and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if you think that evolution is locked in, at least for a while, where affirmatives do kind of need to answer what in the past would have been arguments easily defeated by just fiat solves, and whether you think that type of argument will need to adapt, and in what ways you think it might need to adapt. So on the criminal justice topic, I see a lot of 1NC documents where there might not even be any particularly specific case answers, but there's a couple of generic cards that are like, the DOJ will circumvent, AG Barr will circumvent, the Trump administration will circumvent. And I don't think that those specific cards will be as successful anymore. But I wonder if that same theme will still play out during the Biden administration, that just kind of bureaucracy in general is too slow to turn. Bureaucratic inertia will maintain the status quo even in the face of policy change and that kind of thing. So I guess an open-ended question, how do you think the transition from Trump to Biden will affect those fiat/circumvention arguments? I've heard people call them Trumpers or whatever, but that genre of argument that's about whether fiat solves the intransigence of the administration and executive agencies.
I think if you were a committed circumvention debater, the victory of the Biden administration was arrow direction down, bad development for your circumvention negative argument. Because I do think that a lot of judges that might be evaluating a high school round could just intuitively picture the Trump administration looking at the letter of the law, looking at the letter of the plan, and trying to kind of find a way to navigate around it. And there was just a lot of literature about how the Trump administration wanted certain outcomes and fought to find ways to kind of get there. And so the motivation might be more instinctive for the judging pool with the Trump administration. But I am often amazed at how many of the cards that are being read about circumvention are pre-2016. And a lot of them are actually extremely liberal activists that are frustrated with the Obama administration, and how executive authority under the Obama administration sort of whittled down the goals of certain policies and had them sort of take place in practice a little bit different, because there's a very strong body of literature that says regardless of whether the president is Obama, Trump, or Biden, executives like to kind of rein in and hone their authority relative to other branches. Now, again, a little bit of this is going to come down to the particulars of the criminal justice reform that is at play, and the degree to which the administration dislikes the CJR item at hand is very, very significant. The topic is arguably bidirectional, and if an affirmative had done a criminal justice reform that Trump really, really liked, the most powerful affirmative answer would have been he won't circumvent it, because even if in general he's down with circumvention, he has no motivation to circumvent in this instance. So the place where a negative needs to begin on that front is winning that Joe Biden and members of the Biden administration actually have a motivation to circumvent the item at hand. And that may not be as much of a case on the CJR topic, but I think the negative could be fine with actually reading some slightly older evidence from college executive authority topics, which say that the executive branch and the Obama administration is going to have a lot of the same players in the executive branch that the Biden administration does, that those players want, as a matter of course, to maximize the authority and flexibility of the executive branch, and might therefore kind of be opposed to any other branch sort of stepping in and reining in what they can do on any public policy question, including criminal justice.
So we will leave it there. That was a conversation about the new Biden administration and how students will need to adjust their arguments on the criminal justice reform topic to account for the political changes in Washington. I am Bill Batterman. I coach debate at Woodward Academy, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. Thanks to Will Repko, debate coach at Michigan State University, for sharing his thoughts with you. We will have more of these videos soon, so continue checking this channel for more previews of the 2021 Spartan Debate Institutes.